Bill stepped out October 9th at London's Natural History Museum, where high-level leaders and experts gathered ahead of next year's UN climate. King Charles and Prince William broke their silence with new and unsettling news about Princess Catherine's recovery. Their joint statement was short, but the tension behind it was impossible to ignore. William revealed that Catherine's condition requires more time and more care, while King Charles added a phrase that left reporters frozen. "We ask for understanding in this difficult moment." What difficult moment? What changed? Why now? Something inside the palace has shifted, and today's update feels like the beginning of a much larger truth waiting to come out. When grace began to fade, Princess Catherine was the kind of woman who made everyone around her feel like they mattered. She had this warmth that could fill an entire room without her saying a single word. Her strength wasn't the loud, commanding type. It was quiet and steady, like an ancient oak tree that bends in the storm but never breaks. At least that's what everyone had always believed. But even the strongest trees have roots that can weaken, and Catherine's roots were beginning to fail her in ways she desperately tried to hide. The fatigue crept in like fog rolling across a harbor, so gradual that she didn't notice until it had completely surrounded her. Where she once woke with energy and purpose, she now had to force herself from bed, her limbs feeling heavy and uncooperative. Getting dressed became an exhausting task. Choosing which shoes to wear somehow mandated more mental energy than she could summon. She found herself staring at her wardrobe for long minutes, her mind blank and slow, as if someone had poured molasses through her thoughts. Her hands developed a tremor she couldn't control. It started small, a slight shake when holding a teacup that she blamed on too much caffeine. But it grew worse. She began spilling things, dropping her phone, struggling to sign documents without her signature wobbling across the page like a child's first attempt at writing. She started wearing long sleeves even on warm days, keeping her hands clasped together or hidden in her pockets, terrified someone would notice and ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. The worst part was the moments when she simply disappeared inside her own head. She would be sitting with her children listening to them chatter about their day, and suddenly realize she hadn't heard a word they'd said for the past 5 minutes. Her youngest would tug her sleeve, calling, "Mommy, Mommy," with increasing concern, and she would snap back to awareness with a guilty start, apologizing and asking them to repeat themselves. These episodes frightened her more than the physical symptoms because they made her feel like she was losing herself, slipping away bit by bit while her body remained behind like an empty shell. Catherine became an expert at deception. When her children bounded into her rooms full of excitement and stories, she would summon every ounce of strength she possessed to smile and laugh and engage with them. She would ruffle their hair and pull them close for hugs, breathing in the sweet scent of their shampoo and letting their joy fuel her for a few precious moments. But the instant they skipped away, the smile would slide from her face like melting wax. She would sink into the nearest chair, her whole body trembling with exhaustion, sometimes too weak even to cry. The staff began to notice, though they tried to be discreet. Worried glances were exchanged when Catherine wanted help standing after sitting for too long. Hushed conversations happened behind closed doors about how pale she looked, how thin she was becoming, how her lights seemed to be dimming. The footman who brought her breakfast noticed she barely touched her food anymore. Her lady-in-waiting saw the dark circles under her eyes that no amount of makeup could hide. The housekeeper found her sitting in the dark one afternoon, too exhausted to reach across the room and turn on a lamp. Nobody knew what to say or how to help. Catherine was so determined to appear normal, to keep functioning as if nothing was wrong, that approaching her felt like an intrusion. She would deflect any concern with a wave of her hand and a reassuring comment about being tired or fighting off a cold. She became skilled at changing the subject, at redirecting attention away from herself and onto literally anything else. She protected her suffering like a closely guarded secret, as if admitting something was wrong would make it unbearably real. The night everything changed began like any other. Catherine had managed to get through dinner with her family, participating in the conversation with what she hoped was enough enthusiasm to avoid suspicion. She had kissed her children goodnight, holding each one perhaps a moment longer than usual, memorizing the feeling of their small bodies in her arms. After they were tucked safely in bed, She retreated to her private sitting room, finally allowing herself to stop pretending to stop. The room started spinning violently. Her vision blurred and doubled. A wave of nausea hit her so hard she couldn't even call out for help. She tried to stand, thinking she could make it to the bathroom, or at least to the bell pull to summon assistance. But her legs wouldn't obey the commands her brain was frantically sending. She took one step and collapsed, her knees hitting the floor hard enough to send shock waves of pain up her spine. She lay there on the carpet, unable to move, unable to do anything except breathe and pray that someone would find her soon. Minutes stretched into eternity. The room grew cold around her. Or maybe that was just her body shutting down. She couldn't tell anymore. Every breath felt like work. Her heart hammered irregularly in her chest, sometimes racing so fast it frightened her, then slowing to a crawl that made her wonder if it would simply stop altogether. By the time a staff member discovered her and raised the alarm, Catherine had lost track of how long she'd been lying there. Suddenly, there were voices and hands lifting her carefully onto the sofa. Someone placed a blanket over her shaking body. The palace doctor was summoned urgently from his home, arriving with his medical bag and a deeply worried expression that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. He examined her while the room held its breath. Catherine drifted in and out of awareness, catching fragments of concerned whispers and the sound of medical equipment. She heard someone mention calling her husband, heard the panic creeping into voices that were usually so controlled and proper. The doctor's hands were gentle as he checked her vital signs, his brow furrowing deeper with each measurement he took. When he finally stepped back and removed his stethoscope, the silence in the room was suffocating. Everyone waited for him to speak, to tell them this was something simple and fixable, that their beloved princess would be fine with some rest and perhaps a few vitamins. But the words that came from his mouth landed like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples of dread through everyone present. What diagnosis would force even the most experienced physician to pause before speaking, choosing his words carefully because he knew they would change everything? A husband torn between duty and fear. Prince William was the type of man who remembered small details about people's lives and asked follow-up questions weeks later, who could make a nervous stranger feel at ease with just a warm smile and a few thoughtful words. With Catherine, he was even softer somehow, his whole face changing when she entered a room, his hand always reaching for hers without conscious thought. He had been in a meeting, sitting through another discussion about schedules and appearances and obligations that suddenly felt meaningless. His private secretary's face appeared in the doorway, pale and tense in a way that made William's stomach drop before a single word was spoken. The room fell silent as everyone registered that something was terribly wrong. Several advisors stood nearby with tablets and documents. Everyone started talking at once, asking questions and offering opinions about protocols and statements and official responses. William held up a hand for silence, and the room immediately quieted. He could feel them all studying him, looking for cracks in his composure, wondering if he was holding himself together or falling apart. "What do the doctors say?" his father asked quietly. William swallowed hard, his throat suddenly tight. "They don't know yet. They're running more tests. They say the next day will tell us more. The press is already asking questions." One advisor interjected carefully. "We need to decide how much information." "Nothing." William cut him off sharply. "We say nothing yet. With respect, sir, that may not be possible. There are already rumors circulating, and without official word, speculation will run wild." Behind the door, William heard a monitor beep more urgently, heard the rush of footsteps, heard the doctor's voice calling for something. His whole body went rigid, every muscle screaming at him to go back in there, to be with her, to stop wasting time on things that suddenly seemed completely meaningless. "Figure it out," he said roughly, already turning back toward the bedroom. "I don't care what you say, just keep them away from her." He pushed back through the door, his heart in his throat, terrified of what he might find. The medical team had gathered around her, adjusting equipment and checking readings. The doctor looked up and gave William a small nod. She was stable. Everything was under control, and William felt his knees nearly give out with relief. How much longer could he keep pretending he wasn't terrified? How was he supposed to face tomorrow if she didn't make it through tonight? And how could he possibly explain to their children that the person they loved most in the world might not be coming back to them? A crown that weighs too heavy. King Charles loved his sons fiercely, even when relationships grew complicated and painful, and he had grown to love Catherine like the daughter he never had. She had brought light and stability to William's life, and watching them together always filled Charles with a quiet joy that reminded him what truly mattered beneath all the ceremony and protocol. His own health had been failing lately, something he discussed with no one except his doctors. And the irony of finally ascending to the throne only to feel his body betraying him was not lost on him. The phone call came while he was reviewing documents in his private study. The afternoon sun casting long shadows across the antique desk that had belonged to his grandmother. His private secretary's voice carried a weight that made Charles set down his pen immediately, his hand instinctively moving to his chest where a familiar tightness had begun to form. Catherine's condition had worsened. The doctors were requesting an urgent family meeting. William was already at the hospital and asking for his father. Charles felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, painful exhale. He had known something was wrong, had seen the worry in William's eyes during their last conversation, had noticed Catherine's absence from recent family gatherings, but hearing it confirmed in such stark terms made it devastatingly real. He closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself one moment of private anguish before he would need to be the king again, before he would need to be strong for everyone else who was falling apart. "Prepare the car," he said quietly. "I'm leaving immediately." The drive through London felt interminable despite the traffic clearing for his motorcade. Charles sat in the back seat, staring out the window without seeing the city passing by. His mind wandered through memories of Catherine, her wedding day when she had looked at William with such pure love that Charles had felt his throat tighten. The births of each grandchild when she had glowed with tired happiness. Family dinners where her gentle presence had smoothed over awkward moments and brought genuine laughter to the table. She had never sought the spotlight, never craved attention or power. She had simply loved his son and raised their children with grace and devotion, asking for nothing except the chance to live a relatively normal life within their extraordinary circumstances. And now she was dying. Charles could feel the truth of it in his bones, in the careful way his secretary had chosen his words, in the urgency of the summons. She was dying, and there was nothing his title or wealth or influence could do to stop it. His secretary approached and leaned down to whisper in his ear, and William felt the ground tilt beneath him, even though he was sitting perfectly still. Catherine had collapsed. The doctors were with her now. He wanted to come immediately. William stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He mumbled something about needing to leave, an emergency family matter. The people around the table rose respectfully, their expressions concerned and curious, but he barely saw them. He was already moving toward the door, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. His hands were shaking. He noticed that distantly, the way his fingers trembled as he reached for the door handle, but he shoved them into his pockets where no one could see. The drive back felt endless. Every red light, every slow-moving car, every pedestrian crossing seemed designed specifically to torture him. He sat rigid in the back seat, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. He tried to bargain with the universe, making frantic promises to do anything, give up anything, be anything if she would just be okay. He tried to pray, but couldn't remember the words, his thoughts too scattered and desperate to form coherent sentences. When he finally reached their private quarters, he took the stairs two at a time, despite the protests of the staff trying to brief him. He burst through the door and stopped short, his momentum dying the instant he saw her. Catherine lay on their bed, looking impossibly small and fragile against the white linens. Her eyes were closed, her face colorless, except for the dark shadows beneath her lashes. Medical equipment surrounded her, wires and monitors creating a barrier between them that made his chest constrict painfully. And the doctor stood nearby, speaking quietly with a nurse, and both turned when William entered. "How is she?" His voice came out rougher than intended, edged with barely controlled panic. The doctor approached carefully, and William saw him weighing his words before speaking. That hesitation told William everything he wanted to know, and he felt his knees weaken. He moved to Catherine's bedside before the doctor could start explaining, needing to touch her to confirm she was still there and still breathing. He sank into the chair that had been placed next to the bed and reached for her hand. It felt cold and limp in his, so different from the warm, strong grip he was used to. He lifted it gently and pressed it against his cheek, closing his eyes against the burning sensation building behind them. "I'm here," he whispered, though he didn't know if she could hear him. "I'm right here, darling. You're going to be fine. You have to be fine." The doctor began speaking behind him, using medical terminology that William struggled to follow through the roaring in his ears. Words like critical condition and multiple system failure and uncertain prognosis floated past him, each one landing like a punch. He nodded mechanically, trying to look like he understood, like he was processing the information rationally and calmly the way a future king should. But inside he was screaming. Inside he was a terrified husband watching his wife slip away and feeling utterly powerless to stop it. "We're doing everything we can, Your Royal Highness," the doctor said gently. "The next 24 hours will be crucial." 24 hours? An entire day and night of not knowing whether she would still be breathing when the sun rose again. How was he supposed to survive that? Catherine's fingers moved slightly in his grip, and he leaned forward instantly, hope surging through him. Her eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. She made a small sound, barely more than a breath, and he had to lean closer to hear. "Will," she managed, his name coming out weak and slurred. "I'm here. I've got you." His own voice cracked, and he didn't care who heard it. She tried to say something else, but the effort exhausted her, and she drifted away again, leaving him holding her limp hand and watching her chest rise and fall with shallow breaths that seemed far too fragile. The hours blurred together after that. William refused to leave her side, waving away suggestions that he should rest or eat or take care of other matters. Nothing else mattered. The entire world could grind to a halt for all he cared. He wasn't moving from this chair, but reality didn't stop demanding his attention. His private secretary returned with news that palace advisors wanted to speak with him urgently. His father had called multiple times. The children were asking questions that someone wanted to answer. Decisions had to be made about what information to release publicly, how to handle the inevitable media storm, what to tell family members who were frantic with worry. William ignored it all until he physically couldn't anymore. Finally, reluctantly, he stood and pressed a kiss to Catherine's forehead, lingering there for a moment with his eyes closed and his hand cradling her face. "I'll be right back," he promised. 5 minutes, that's all." He stepped into the adjoining sitting room where a group had assembled, all watching him with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed alarm. His father was there, his face drawn with concern. Back at the palace, he had walked these corridors thousands of times throughout his life. But today, each step felt like trudging through deep water. The paintings on the walls stared down at him. Ancestors who had faced their own tragedies and losses, who had made impossible choices and carried unbearable burdens. He wondered if any of them had felt this crushing sense of helplessness, this rage at fate that offered no outlet or resolution. Staff members bowed as he passed, their faces carefully neutral, but he could see the concern in their eyes. News traveled fast within these walls, and everyone who served the family had grown to care for Catherine deeply. She remembered their names, asked about their children, treated them with kindness that was never performative or calculated. Her genuine warmth had won loyalty that no amount of royal authority could command. Charles found himself pausing outside the room where family photographs lined a side table. He picked up one from the previous summer, all of them gathered at Balmoral. Catherine laughing at something one of the children had said, her arm around William's waist, sunshine in her hair. She had looked so healthy then, so vibrant and alive. How had things deteriorated so quickly? Why had no one noticed sooner that something was seriously wrong? The guilt pressed down on him alongside the grief. Should he have paid more attention? Should he have insisted on medical intervention earlier when the signs were there for anyone who looked closely enough? He was the head of this family, and somehow he had failed to protect one of its most precious members. Priya's own doctor had warned him just last week that stress was worsening his condition, that he wanted to slow down and take better care of himself. But how could he rest when his son was living through a nightmare? How could he think about his own health when Catherine was fighting for every breath? The hospital loomed ahead, and Charles braced himself for what he would find inside. The drive had given him time to compose his features, to lock away his personal anguish behind the mask of calm authority that had become second nature over the years. But the moment he walked into the private wing and saw William's face, all his carefully constructed composure threatened to crumble. His son looked like he had aged a decade overnight. William's eyes were red and hollow, his shoulders hunched under the weight of fear and exhaustion. When he saw his father, something in his expression broke, and for a moment he looked like a little boy again, desperately needing someone to tell him everything would be all right. Charles crossed to him and pulled him into an embrace, something they rarely did anymore. William's whole body was trembling. "How bad is it?" Charles asked quietly. William pulled back, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "They're saying we need to prepare for the worst. Her organs are shutting down. They've tried everything, and nothing is working." The words landed like hammer blows. Charles felt his own legs weaken, and he reached out to steady himself against the wall. This couldn't be happening. Not to Catherine. Not to someone so young, so vital, so desperately wanted by everyone who loved her. "The children," he managed to ask. "They don't know yet. Not everything. I can't." William's voice cracked. "I don't know how to tell them their mother might not come home." Before Charles could respond, a physician approached, her expression grave and exhausted. She was flanked by two specialists, and the sight of all three of them together told Charles this was the meeting they had been summoned for, the conversation that would change everything. They gathered in a small conference room that smelled of antiseptic and defeat. The lead physician sat across from them, her hands folded on the table, her eyes filled with compassion that Charles knew meant she was about to deliver news no one wanted to hear. "Your Majesties," she began carefully, "I'm afraid Princess Catherine's condition has deteriorated beyond what we initially anticipated. The infection has spread to multiple organ systems, and despite our most aggressive interventions, her body is not responding to treatment." "What does that mean?" William's voice was barely a whisper. "Exactly. What are you telling us?" The doctor took a breath. "It means that without a miracle in the next 48 hours, we will need to begin discussing end-of-life care and allowing the family time to say goodbye." The room seemed to tilt. Charles heard William make a sound like he'd been physically struck. The other physicians looked down at their hands, clearly wishing they could be anywhere else. "There must be something," Charles said, his voice suddenly stronger, more commanding. "Some treatments we haven't tried. Some specialists we can bring in. Money is no object. We can fly in anyone from anywhere. We've already consulted with the leading experts in 3 countries," the doctor interrupted gently. "Everyone agrees that we've done everything medically possible. Now it's a matter of her body finding the strength to fight. And I'm afraid that strength is running out." William stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the glass, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs he could no longer contain. Charles felt something inside him crack, watching his son's anguish. This was the child he had held as a baby, the boy he had tried to protect from the cruelties of public life, the man who had finally found happiness and was now watching it slip away despite every desperate effort to hold on. "We need to make some decisions," the doctor continued quietly. "The public will need to know something soon. The family should be gathered. And you'll need to discuss with Princess Catherine, if she's lucid, what her wishes are regarding life support, if it comes to that." Life support. The words hung in the air like poison. They were talking about machines and tubes, and the awful decision of when to turn them off. They were talking about the end of a life that should have stretched decades into the future. About children growing up without their mother. About William facing the rest of his life alone. Charles looked at the doctors, then at his son's broken form by the window, then down at his own hands that suddenly seemed so old and useless. Everything he had, power, position, wealth beyond measure, and none of it could save the woman his son loved. "We tell the truth," Charles said finally, his voice heavy with resignation and grief. "We tell the nation that Princess Catherine is gravely ill. We ask for their prayers and their privacy, and we prepare them for the possibility that she may not survive." William turned from the window, his face wet with tears. How do we tell them that? How do we put into words that we're losing her? What statement could possibly capture the magnitude of this loss? The heartbreak of a family watching helplessly as their brightest light flickered and threatened to go dark forever. A nation holds its breath. William loved fiercely and quietly, showing his devotion through small gestures rather than grand declarations. A hand on the small of Catherine's back as they walked. The way he always made sure she was comfortable before settling himself. How he looked at her across crowded rooms as if she was the only person who existed. Fatherhood had softened him further, bringing out a playfulness that delighted his children and a protectiveness that bordered on fierceness. The palace office felt suffocating despite its grand proportions. Communication staff moved quietly around the conference table, their usual efficiency replaced by a somber carefulness, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make the situation more real. Papers were shuffled. Computer screens glowed with draft after draft of the statement that no one wanted to write, but everyone knew had become necessary. William sat at the head of the table, his father beside him, both men staring at the document before them with expressions that revealed nothing and everything simultaneously. The words swam across the page, each sentence a knife twisting deeper into wounds that were already bleeding freely. "It is with deep concern that we must inform the public." William read aloud, his voice flat and distant. He stopped, shaking his head. "This is impossible. How do we tell millions of people that she might not?" He couldn't finish the sentence. His throat closed around the words, refusing to release them into the world where they would become unbearably solid and true. Charles reached over and placed his hand on his son's arm. "We tell them the truth as gently as possible. We ask for their understanding and their prayers. That's all we can do. The public will want details," one of the communications directors said hesitantly. "They'll want to know what happened, what the prognosis is, whether there's hope. Then we give them what we can without." William trailed off, pressing his fingers against his temples. Without making her suffering into entertainment, they revised the statement again and again. Each version felt simultaneously too revealing and not honest enough. How could mere words capture the gravity of what was happening behind hospital walls? How could any announcement convey the terror of watching someone you love slip away despite every desperate attempt to pull them back? William watched the response unfold through news feeds and reports streaming into the office. The outpouring of love and concern was overwhelming. Thousands of messages flooding in. Crowds gathering outside the hospital despite palace requests for privacy. Entire communities coming together in spontaneous shows of support. But none of it changed the only thing that mattered. None of the prayers or flowers or tears could heal Catherine's failing body or guarantee she would survive the night. How long would the world have to wait before learning whether their collective hope was enough, or whether they would soon be mourning a loss too terrible to comprehend? The hours that felt like forever. Princess Charlotte had always been remarkably perceptive, reading emotions in people's faces the way other children read storybooks. She possessed an intuitive understanding of feelings that seemed almost magical, knowing when someone wanted a hug or a kind word or simply her presence beside them. There was a brightness to her spirit that drew people in, a warmth inherited directly from her mother that made everyone she met feel special and seen. At 9 years old, she loved ballet and her baby brother in equal measure, defended her friends fiercely on the playground, and still believed wholeheartedly in fairy tales where everything ended happily. But sitting in the quiet nursery with her brothers, watching shadows lengthen across the carpet while adults whispered behind closed doors, Charlotte was beginning to understand that some stories didn't have the ending she wanted. "Why can't we visit her?" she asked when her father finally came to sit with them, his face gray with exhaustion and worry. "We could make her feel better. We always make her smile." William pulled her close, and she felt him trembling slightly. "The doctors need Mommy to rest right now, sweetheart. She's fighting very hard to get well, and we have to let her focus all her energy on getting stronger." George sat rigid and silent, his jaw clenched in a way that made him look suddenly older. Louis nestled against their father, thumb in his mouth. Even though he'd stopped that habit months ago, they were all reverting to younger versions of themselves, seeking comfort in the only ways they knew how. Down the hallway, Charles stood with Camilla and other family members who had gathered in quiet solidarity. The room felt heavy with unspoken fears and prayers that seemed too fragile to voice aloud. "How much longer can this go on?" Camilla whispered, her composure finally cracking, watching William destroy himself while Charles shook his head, unable to finish the thought for her. They had been here before in different circumstances, but with the same crushing helplessness, and the memories made everything worse. Night descended like a curtain falling. At the hospital, William maintained his vigil outside Catherine's door, pacing the same stretch of corridor he'd worn smooth with his footsteps over endless hours. Inside, medical staff moved with controlled urgency, their faces revealing nothing, while their actions told him everything he wanted to know about how precarious her hold on life had become. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the door burst open. A nurse rushed past him, calling for additional personnel. William's heart stopped completely as he watched the organized chaos unfold. People moving with practiced efficiency that only came from fighting death on a regular basis. He pressed himself against the wall, forcing himself to breathe, to stay conscious, to not collapse under the weight of terror that was crushing his chest. Hours passed this way, crisis after crisis, alarms sounding and then quieting. Medical teams conferring in tones too low for him to hear, but urgent enough to strip away any remaining hope he'd been clinging to. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray through the windows, the lead physician emerged, looking decades older than when the night had begun. "Your Royal Highness," he said quietly, and William braced himself for words that would end his world. "There's been an unexpected development, something we didn't anticipate." What change had occurred in those dark hours that would alter everything the family thought they understood about Catherine's condition?